The night of April 26, 1986, began like any other in Pripyat. The small town, built to house the workers of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, was quiet and serene. The residents, unaware of the impending disaster, went about their nightly routines. Children were tucked into bed, and parents settled in for a peaceful night's sleep. Families slept soundly in their beds. The gentle breeze carried the scent of spring through open windows. The air was filled with the promise of a new day, a day that would never come as expected. The tranquility of the night was deceptive, masking the brewing catastrophe. Nothing hinted at the impending catastrophe. At 1:23 a.m., a monstrous roar split the night. The sound was deafening, a harbinger of the disaster that was unfolding. The peaceful night was shattered in an instant, replaced by chaos and fear. The earth trembled. A blinding light illuminated the sky. The force of the explosion was so immense that it could be felt miles away. The once calm and quiet town of Pripyat was now a scene of utter devastation. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had exploded. The explosion was catastrophic, tearing through the reactor's structure and releasing a deadly cloud of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. The explosion was like nothing ever witnessed before. The force ripped through the reactor's roof, spewing radioactive debris high into the atmosphere. The night sky was filled with a toxic plume, a grim testament to the power of the explosion. A plume of burning graphite and nuclear fuel rose into the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the surrounding countryside. The fire burned with an intensity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The glow could be seen for miles, a beacon of the disaster that had struck. The core of the reactor, once a controlled source of energy, transformed into an inferno of lethal radiation. The intense heat and radiation made it impossible to approach the reactor. The situation was dire, and the full extent of the disaster was yet to be realized. The immediate vicinity of the power plant became a scene of chaos and confusion. People were unsure of what had happened, and panic began to spread. The once orderly environment of the power plant was now a chaotic mess, with debris scattered everywhere. First responders, firefighters, and plant workers rushed towards the disaster, unaware of the invisible enemy they faced. The radiation, though unseen, was deadly. These brave individuals were the first to confront the disaster, their actions driven by a sense of duty and urgency. They battled the flames with courage and determination, their heroic efforts a testament to human bravery in the face of unimaginable danger. Despite the overwhelming odds, they fought to contain the disaster, risking their lives to protect others. Their bravery and sacrifice would be remembered for generations to come. The Chernobyl disaster was not a random act of fate or mere chance. It was the culmination of a series of human errors and design flaws that transformed a routine safety test into an unmitigated catastrophe of epic proportions. The test aimed to assess the reactor's ability to power emergency systems in the event of a sudden power outage. The RBMK-1000 reactor, a Soviet design, had inherent weaknesses, particularly at low power levels, which were not fully understood. These weaknesses, coupled with a disregard for established safety protocols, set the stage for disaster. Operators, under immense pressure to complete the test, disabled critical safety systems and withdrew control rods too quickly. This dangerous combination created a perfect storm of instability within the reactor's core, leading to chaos. The reactor, stripped of its safeguards and pushed beyond its limits, surged completely out of control. A sudden power surge triggered a massive steam explosion, followed by a second, even more devastating blast that shook the facility. The reactor core, its temperature soaring out of control, ruptured, spewing its deadly radioactive contents into the atmosphere. In the nearby town of Pripyat, life continued as normal in the hours following the explosion. The town, built to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, was a model of Soviet urban planning. It was a place of hope and progress, where families thrived and children dreamed of bright futures. Children played in the parks, unaware of the invisible danger raining down from the sky. Laughter echoed through the playgrounds as they swung on swings and slid down slides, blissfully ignorant of the radioactive particles that were beginning to settle on their skin and clothes. Parents went about their daily routines, oblivious to the silent killer lurking in the air they breathed. They shopped for groceries, chatted with neighbors, and enjoyed the mild spring weather, completely unaware that their lives were about to be irrevocably changed. It would be 36 agonizing hours before the Soviet authorities ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. During this time, the residents were exposed to dangerously high levels of radiation with no warning of the catastrophe that had unfolded just miles away. When the order finally came, it was swift and chaotic. Loudspeakers blared the evacuation orders, and panic spread through the town like wildfire. People rushed to pack their belongings, grabbing whatever they could carry in the limited time they had. Residents were told to pack only essential belongings, assured that they would return in a few days. Many left behind cherished possessions, believing they would soon be back to reclaim them. The reality, however, was far more grim. Buses lined the streets, their engines rumbling as they waited to ferry the unsuspecting population away from their homes. The sight of the long lines of buses was both reassuring and terrifying, a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Families bid hurried farewells, clinging to the hope of a swift return. Tears were shed, and promises were made to reunite soon. The emotional weight of the moment was palpable, as people left behind not just their homes, but their entire way of life. Pripyat, once a bustling town of nearly 50,000 souls, became a ghost town, its streets eerily deserted, its buildings standing as silent sentinels to the tragedy. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the vibrant life that once filled the town. Toys lay abandoned in playgrounds, half-eaten meals sat on tables, and family photos still hung on walls, haunting reminders of lives abruptly shattered. The remnants of daily life stood as ghostly echoes of a past that could never be reclaimed, a poignant testament to the human cost of the disaster. The invisible terror of Chernobyl knew no borders. The explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986 was not just a local disaster, it was a global catastrophe. The radioactive particles released into the atmosphere did not respect national boundaries. They were carried by the wind, spreading far and wide, creating a web of contamination that reached across continents. Carried by the wind, radioactive fallout spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, reaching across Europe and beyond. The winds carried the radioactive particles over vast distances, depositing them on the ground, in water sources and on vegetation. Countries that were thousands of miles away from the epicenter of the disaster found themselves grappling with the fallout. The invisible particles settled on the soil, contaminating crops and entering the food chain, posing a long-term threat to human health and the environment. The silent and insidious nature of the threat magnified the global sense of alarm. People watched in horror as news of the disaster spread. The lack of immediate visible effects made the situation even more terrifying. The fear of the unknown, the invisible enemy, created a sense of helplessness and anxiety. People were unsure of how to protect themselves and their loved ones from the invisible threat that had infiltrated their lives. Governments scrambled to assess the risks while citizens watched in fear as the invisible enemy infiltrated their world. The initial response was chaotic, with conflicting information and a lack of clear guidance. Governments around the world had to quickly mobilize resources to monitor radiation levels, provide accurate information to the public, and implement measures to protect their populations. The challenge was immense, and the stakes were high. Sweden, hundreds of miles away, was among the first to detect abnormally high levels of radiation. The detection of radiation in Sweden was a wake-up call to the world. It highlighted the far-reaching impact of the disaster and the need for international cooperation in addressing the fallout. Scientists and experts from different countries came together to share data, conduct research, and develop strategies to mitigate the effects of the radiation. The Soviet Union, initially reluctant to acknowledge the disaster, was forced to confront the reality of the situation. The scale of the disaster was too great to hide, and the international community demanded transparency and accountability. The Soviet Union had to admit the severity of the situation and work with other countries to address the crisis. This marked a significant shift in the way the world approached nuclear safety and disaster management. The world watched in horror as the true scale of the catastrophe unfolded. The media played a crucial role in bringing the reality of the disaster to the global audience. Images of the devastated nuclear plant, The affected areas and the suffering of the people impacted by the radiation were broadcasted worldwide. The emotional response was overwhelming, and the disaster became a rallying point for calls for greater nuclear safety and environmental protection. The invisible fallout contaminated crops, water sources and livestock, spreading fear and uncertainty far and wide. The contamination of the environment had long-term consequences for agriculture and food security. Farmers faced the devastating reality of losing their livelihoods, and consumers were concerned about the safety of their food. The impact on the ecosystem was profound, with radiation affecting not just humans but also wildlife and natural habitats. The long-term consequences of exposure to radiation, particularly for children, remained a source of deep anxiety. The health effects of radiation exposure were not immediately apparent, but the potential for long-term damage was a constant worry. Children, being more vulnerable to the effects of radiation, were a particular concern. Parents and healthcare workers faced the daunting task of monitoring and managing the health of those exposed to the fallout. The Chernobyl disaster served as a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of the world and the potential for human actions to have far-reaching and devastating consequences. It underscored the need for international cooperation in addressing global challenges and the importance of transparency, accountability, and preparedness in managing such crises. The lessons learned from Chernobyl continue to shape policies and practices in nuclear safety and environmental protection, reminding us of the shared responsibility we have in safeguarding our planet.